Hi everybody. So we'll be going through the round one motion from NUSPA. This house opposes Singapore's land reclamation strategy. I'm again gonna keep this relatively brief, in the sense that this is a prepared round. I'm gonna assume that teams did their research on what the strategies are, and therefore we don't have to go through a lot of the content based parts of this motion. If not, Google is still available um, as of the time of recording, so use that. So instead, what I want to do and how I usually structure these breakdowns is I want to focus on questions. Um, Specifically, I think what questions um, a team should be looking at before they even think about what side they are on. Um, and in general, I think it's always useful to have a broad understanding of where the debate is happening and what debate is taking place before you go into your research. So in this case, there are, I think, three broad questions that you should be asking yourself at the point where you receive this motion, right? Assuming that you have a day or two to prepare. The first question is what is this strategy actually? So what is the land reclamation strategy? What time frame are we looking at? Are we thinking about the present day, or are we thinking about the past? Right? And are we thinking about the historical perspective here and the way in which land reclamation has happened in Singapore since 1965? Um, and I think that there are a few important things to note about the fact that this is probably to some extent a historical motion. The first is that you have to understand how important the historical angle is to either side. Um, you probably also have to understand what the harms of land reclamation were, pre the present day, because one can say that, in the 1980s, for example, or 70s, land reclamation was seen to be a good thing in Singapore. But it did cause a number of crucial harms. It sort of decimated the fishing industry, um, and the livelihoods of fishermen in not just our country, but also the countries that we were taking um, land from, or taking sand from, I should say. Right. And I think that there is a historical legacy, right? Um, there has been um, a historical legacy of like harm, right? That has occurred as a result. Um, I think the other thing you want to think about is whether this strategy has changed over time. So, are we doing more land reclamation now, less land reclamation? Has the way in which we've adopted land reclamation as a strategy changed? Um, we're using less sand, more sand. What's the current status quo versus how it was done 30 years ago? And then I think finally, the purpose of land reclamation, right? Is it merely to connect islands, like in the case of Jurong Island, sorry. Is it for use for commercial reasons or industrial reasons? Is it for residential reasons? Is it because we need more space for camps? Or I think in more recent years, environmental reasons as well, right? The building of the new Long Island along the east coast can be attributed to the need to sort of have a buffer against rising sea levels here in Singapore. So what is the purpose of these efforts? So that's the first, I think, broad question you want to ask yourself when you receive this motion. The second question is, what is the counterfactual? So are there other solutions that can exist or that do exist uh, in replacement of land reclamation. Now, I don't think that there is a solution that is like set in stone. Like this is the solution to solve all of Singapore's problems. Otherwise, um you wouldn't need land reclamation at all. But are there ways to mitigate some of the harms if Singapore didn't engage in land reclamation? Were there other things that could have been done instead? In some land reclamation projects, for instance, you can think about potentially the building of seawalls. Um, if you're thinking about residential, capacity, the need for more land in some parts of Singapore, one question you might want to ask yourself is whether it's actually necessary to have um, um, to grow the population as quickly as we did, um, or rather, perhaps, is there still a need right now to use land reclamation for residential housing when the reality is that we don't have a high birth rate, and the main reason why we are increasing our population nowadays is because of immigration rather um, than birth, right? And that itself is perhaps a something that can be reconsidered, right? Instead. And I think that the third question is who is affected by this strategy. So obviously Singapore is affected by this strategy, but it's affected in more ways than one. It's also affected in terms of its relationship with its neighbors, right? Like so, Indonesia, Malaysia have and many countries in Southeast Asia have refused to sell sand to Singapore, because the expansion of the island also means the expansion of our borders, right? Which some countries find to be a problem, right? Is the trade-off worth it for Singapore, but also for our neighbors, right? This is not a Singapore motion by any stretch of the imagination. That means that what's happening in Cambodia, environmentally, and in terms of the livelihoods of the local villagers there that um, are at the brunt of this sand export to Singapore, you know, um, bringing them into the debate is probably quite important, if you're on proposition. So, having said all of that, right? What do I think the um relative strategies, right, of the two teams should be in this debate? So I think if you're on proposition, the first thing that you should try and do is find a better historical or present model of development. That's difficult, but it's not impossible. So, what should Singapore have done instead, right? Of engaging in so many land reclamation projects? Like, did we need Jurong Island to be connected? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer was in building bridges instead, or doing a bit less of that land reclamation. Was it necessary, for instance, to expand, right, the eastern side of Singapore, um, to build expansion to the airport? Is it necessary to build this much housing on reclaimed land right now? Um, Instead of potentially thinking about things like managing our reduced population anyway. Is it necessary to build Long Island when there are better strategies for mitigating rising sea levels that countries like the Netherlands, for example, have already adopted and implemented? Of course, the Netherlands did also test out or are doing this uh, strategy of having some wetlands that can be flooded to try and mitigate rising sea levels, but they have other strategies as well. So I don't think any of this is debate winning, but I think providing some solutions allow you to say that we oppose it because we didn't need as much land as we were taking, and consequently, um, we could have had a better relationship with our neighbors. We could have not screwed over the fishermen in Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, um, the villagers in Cambodia, for instance, right now that bear the brunt of environmental impacts from our land reclamation, right? And therefore the present harm that has accrued to the world is outstrips, right, the past unique benefit that we got from land reclamation. So obviously this is a research intensive motion, right? If not, it wouldn't be a prep round motion. But I think the pitfall, I think, of many teams in on prop was sort of not understanding what the counterfactual could have been, and focusing your attention on that, and then also focusing your attention on the global angle, right? And sort of explaining why people, losing their livelihoods or dying overseas is not as important as the fact that oh sorry, it's more important, my bad, than the lives of people in Singapore presently, given that we're already in a privileged position. And so the fact that we are still engaging in so much land reclamation is a problem, right? And is something that is perhaps both principally illegitimate and unfair, but also just practically, doing more harm than good to the world. Opposition, I think, you want to espouse on why land reclamation was necessary in the past for Singapore, and then from that point, sort of say that whatever, even if we say that we don't need this much land reclamation today, we definitely needed it for Singapore to have survived in the past, to become an economic hub, to thrive as a society. And then I think sort of situating Singapore's interest in the in the debate, saying why this is, like the motion has to focus more on Singapore's interests, um, and giving believable reasons why that has to be the debate, will be quite useful for opposition. I think most ops didn't have trouble in this debate. Most op teams won, but against a prop team that does a lot more framing and contextualization, I think it would be necessary to do the second point here. And there's a few ways to do it, right? The first thing is to say, obviously, like land reclamation is not a uniquely Singapore concept. It happens in many other countries as well, because naturally you need more land in some parts of your country rather than others. You may need, to reclaim certain islands for strategic reasons. So other countries are also engaging in land reclamation anyway, and therefore, all the sort of harms that accrue from land reclamation um, would have happened regardless, right? And therefore, if Singapore's land reclamation attempts are sort of a drop in the ocean compared to Hong Kong, parts of Europe, then the real question here is how does Singapore benefit or is hurt by these attempts? And so I think that's one of the ways in which you should be able to bring the debate back to Singapore, even if Prop tries to introduce the international angle. And I think on the Singapore front, you'll be a lot more comfortable in terms of your arguments. So weighing becomes important, and sort of debating what the debate is about becomes quite important in this motion. And I think teams, once you sort of do your research and understand, what the strategy is and all the different angles, then it's about sort of packaging your material to have that focus on weighing and on situating the debate in the context or in the frame that suits your side. So I think that's how you can sort of increase your chances of winning this motion. So yeah, that's it for this topic.